So this is the functional model. Because I'm from Monash, it's got to be a continuum model. Actually, yeah, it didn't, but it ended up that way. And I decided to use the circles and lines kind of depiction of that, although some of the continuum models that are emerging now differ from that slightly. One of my colleagues, Lisa Gibbons, I don't know if you know Lisa, who recently last year got a position at Kent State University in the States. Her thesis was on the cultural continuum model, and she uses a slightly different depiction, and she's actually got more dimensions, and it's quite interesting. I decided to stick with this because it's kind of what I know. Despite it being circles and lines, Frank doesn't like the model particularly. It doesn't, in some ways, it doesn't fit in with some of his things. It's really like the records continuum model, but sort of twisted inside out. And what it's saying is, people's agency in records. Well, the records continuum model talks about distantiation from the point of creation of a record. So you create it, then you capture it, and organise it and pluralise it. So it's distantiation from the record. What this is talking about is people's agency in records depends on distantiation from the activities that gave rise to the record. So the closer someone is to the activity that's being recorded, that was recorded or is being recorded, the closer they are, the more agency they perhaps desire or need in those records. So dimension one is someone who has directly experienced something. So someone's been put in out-of-home care, for example. So they actually feel they need the greatest agency in their records. They need to know what records are being created. They want to have the rights to perhaps document or annotate them. They may want to have the right to destroy them, all of that kind of thing. By the way, it's a continuum model, so there's multiple perspectives on all of this, and all these rights may be conflicting, and there may be multiple sets of rights that need to be negotiated. So basically, someone that's experienced some event that is recorded, they may need to have a role in negotiating the whole management of this stuff, and they need fully interoperable infrastructure because their records are going to be spread across multiple systems. And they're necessarily directly involved in the actual records, the actual traces themselves. The next dimension out is identify, which is someone that hasn't maybe directly experienced those circumstances, but identify with it as part of their worldview. And a good example of that might be a community, for example, an Indigenous community that identifies with those records. It's part of their social thing. They didn't get a chance to actually create the traces, but they actually quite often have a delegated environment which they can manage the curation perhaps of some of these records, and are concerned with how they may be documented, for example. So dimension 2 is typically satisfied by our ideas of community archives, where they have a space for sort of self-determination. The third dimension is relate, and again that's stepping back from those circumstances. A good example of relate is something like the Mapping Our Anzacs collection, where I can relate to my grandfather being in World War I. I want to maybe contribute some sort of content, perhaps as an annotation. I actually am invited into the space to contribute. I need some interlinked kind of connections to allow me to do that. I want to contribute, I want to be seen to have been contributed. I'm not particularly concerned with the actual curation or management of that stuff, but I'm operating at arm's length. So this is the space of typically Archives 2.0, where we can have tagging and annotation and that kind of stuff. Wikis. And dimension 4 are researchers, and by researchers I mean anyone with an intellectual or entertainment desire to interact with a set of records. Their interaction tends to be very transactional, it's moderated, and that's our typical portal kind of environment into archives. So we do dimension 2 with community archives well, we understand dimension 3 with Archives 2.0, we understand the archival portal kind of environment. What we don't really do well is dimension 1, which is people that have actually experienced something and actually need deep control or negotiated agency into their particular records. That was really brief, and there's 10,000 words in that paper that I sent around. So that sort of turns it on its head. It's thinking about the activities that gave rise to the records more than the actual records themselves. And one of the main things that comes out of this is that there are going to be many people, this makes it explicit, there are going to be many people with different worldviews that have different requirements with access to records. And our standards at the moment don't really allow multiple worldviews of documentation around our records. So once I'd sort of come to this, I started to do the ontology work, started to think about the metadata model that would support multiple worldviews and kind of a flexible way of documenting this stuff.